So here's the raw sound we're gonna work with. Just a solo cello. So to perform that trick, we need to duplicate this track. And the second layer, we're going to pitch down here with the tune knob by 2 semitones. I will explain later why 2. And then I go here into the MIDI modifiers. If you don't see them, you could click this wheel here, or whatever it's called, or wrench icon. And you can bring it up that way here. MIDI, you need the MIDI modifiers. So, and then we would compensate for the difference in pitch by transposing it up 2 semitones. So the tune knob would tune down the samples. So if we don't compensate, we get that. If we put them both together. We're basically just getting the same samples, but in this duplicate track here, the samples are pitched down by 2 semitones. So we get a pitch clash, basically. So we need to compensate this. This compensates basically the MIDI input and the MIDI data on the tracks. It compensates. And that's what we need. So that way we get the same pitch as this track above. So we can see we basically have 2 cellos playing here right now. I'm just gonna increase the volume of both somewhat, and we could switch to a longer articulation here. So that's mostly the basics here. And the reason it needs to be 2 semitones is that samples are generally recorded in 2 steps. So those 2 would be the same sample. I don't know if that's actually the range here. It's just the principle I'm explaining. Oops. Let's just ignore that. So that would be 1 sample from a sampling point of view. That would be the next sample. And that would be the next sample. So it's always like 1 sample stretched by 2 pitches, basically. That's to avoid, to save some money while recording and to not overload the drive. Like if you think about some of the big sample libraries like BBC Symphonic Orchestra, wasn't it like 1 terabyte of samples? I don't know if it's 1 terabyte of samples before or after compression. I don't know if the download is that big. I don't want to spread false rumors. You can just read up on it on the page. But yeah, some sample libraries are obviously pretty huge. And if they would be sampled in... If each pitch was an individual sample, we would have twice as many samples as if we instead have 1 set of samples for every second pitch, basically. So those would be the intervals in which most samples are recorded, rather than... I basically know nothing about musical terminology, so I just explain it that way, in a limpy way with examples. So, back to the transpose trick. And if you would only transpose by 1 semitone, you might get the same samples still. So you would get phasing because you basically just use the same samples essentially clashing on top of each other. You might just get a volume bump or phasing. So you can of course also pitch samples up. It's basically just the same principle. You still access a different set of samples. But I generally prefer to pitch it down although you can also do everything at the same time. You could here have 3 duplicates. And this one, one example that is pitched up. So if you pitch the samples up or pitch the samples down via tuning, you'd have to put up, compensate upwards with the MIDI modifiers. And in this case, we'd have it pitched up, and we would have to compensate downwards with the MIDI modifiers. But all taken together, we've got 3 cellos. Compared to the default patch. So, and would also be a good thing to play around with the mic positions. For instance, I think it's not really a good idea to layer together like mono close mics. So if we just solo the mono close mics, that's what we would get. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, I guess it works. At least I've had some bad results with the mono close mics and that trick being layered together. So it could be worthwhile to have only the first patch use the mixed position, which would include that close mic, and then, for instance, use just the main and room mics for the layers. That way, we can basically just have different sound on each layer depending on what sounds best. We can also, of course, process them differently, and that way it would sound like this. I think that's a little bit better than how it sounded like before. That's the default patch again. So you can do all sorts of stuff with that, and that's mostly it. Some libraries are sampled in 3 steps, so it's always a little bit hard to tell without looking under the hood in Kontakt. In that case, it's locked, so you can't look under the hood, but I'm just going to show how you would do that if it wasn't locked. For instance, here we got Spitfire chamber strings. So we're just looking at the spiccatos here. And if it's not locked, you would see this wrench icon here. Then you'd click at that, and you'd open the mapping editor if it's not open already. If it's gray, then it's already open and you just have to scroll down. If it's not, you have to click it. Then ideally you would also open the group editor or this expert window here on the left. That way it gets, of course, a little bit confusing, but this is basically just the sample groups. This is just how samples are organized. You just throw the samples into that instrument and then put them into groups. So if you have a patch with multiple sets of samples, like if this patch would contain marcato, staccato, and so on, you would have spiccato, marcato, and so on. You would have these groups here. In this case, we just got the spiccatos with mic positions. So you get the groups for these mic positions here, the close, the tree, ambient. Some developers are more messy with naming things than others. In that case, it's pretty okay. And if you want to see how the sampling is done from an interval point of view, from a pitch point of view, sometimes you have to declick this value here, selected groups only. That way all of the samples that are in this patch are being shown. So, and in this case we can see the samples cover 2 keys. So it's basically the same thing. It's sampled in 2 steps. So here's one set of samples. You can see it by the boundaries of these of these blocks. If you click on them, clearly 2 keys. Here, 2 keys. That's one sample here. That's the next sample, stretched across these 2 keys. So now you might understand even better why we have to pitch it down by 2 semitones rather than just 1, and 3 would not make any sense either. But it depends on the sets of samples. So if you can take a look under the hood, it would be good to do so, to see how the sampling is being done. Oh, and the very first sample is usually sampled in semitones. So you might run into some issues there too, especially due to pitching. You of course have the samples start at a different time too. So if we go back to the cello example, I'm just demonstrating it, then it's the easiest to understand. You have to pay attention to the lowest note when you perform this trick. So let's go to the main patch. So that's the lowest note on the main patch. Now play the same note here. Oh, we get nothing. Well, that's because we have pitched up the samples. We have pitched up the patch. So the starting point of the samples has also moved up by 2 semitones. So we only get the sample from here onwards rather than from here. Which is also important to keep in mind with legato, because if you overlap, if you trigger a legato outside the boundaries of your pitched patch, your pitched layer, you're just not gonna get a transition. You're not gonna get anything. It's just gonna drop out. So it's something to pay attention to. And in the next layer, we can play that lowest note from the original patch and even a lower one because we've pitched it down. So we have extended the boundaries basically by 2 semitones downwards. And for that, we get the same issue in reverse, but on the highest note, which has moved lower for that lower pitched one. It's pretty basic logical stuff, but just something to keep in mind.